Hello and welcome to Developing Story. I'm Kevin Clarke, Senior Editor and Chief Correspondent for America Media. This morning, Pope Francis revised the Catholic Church's official teaching on the death penalty to say that capital punishment is inadmissible in all cases, and that it should be abolished worldwide. Here to talk with us about the revision to the Catholic Catechism is Sister Helen Prejean, a renowned anti-death penalty activist and author of the book Dead Man Walking. Sister Prejean joins us on the phone from Wyoming. Thank you for joining us today, Sister Prejean. How are things there?
Oh, it's a happy day. We've been waiting for this for over 1,600 years for this position of the Church. No exceptions on the death penalty. I'm a very happy person today.
It's a very happy day for Sister Helen and anti-death penalty activists around the United States and the world. I just want to remind our audience who are joining us to please tweet comments with your questions for a chance to have them answered on the air, and I'll try to get through to them as we proceed in the next 10 minutes or so. Sister Helen, so nice to hear from you again. Can you very briefly tell us what changed today? What was this revision? I know it's one you've been seeking for a long time for the Catechism. So what does Catholics in the pew need to know about the changes that happened today in Rome?
The huge thing is the inviolable dignity of guilty people who have done terrible crimes. The Catechism had often stated the dignity of innocent life, and people who are pro-life Catholics stand for the dignity of all life. But where it pushed us today, right into the heart of the gospel, is even those who have done terrible crimes have an inviolable dignity. And part of that dignity is not to be strapped down and rendered defenseless and killed by an intentional act. That's what changed in this. No exceptions. And because there had been loopholes in the teaching where possibly say, well, if it out of absolute necessity, and district attorneys would quote that from the Catholic Catechism. So now all the loopholes are shut off. Pure gospel of Jesus, thou shalt not kill, and you cannot put the power in the hands of the state to decide that some of its citizens can be killed for their crimes.
Do you think when Pope John Paul II led the change of the Catechism, was it in 1992 that the Catechism was slightly revised, or was it after?
It was 95, and then in 97 was when they did the Latin edition, the definitive one, and it was right in that window of time that I got to have a dialogue directly with Pope John Paul. And the crux of what I was asking him was that when I'm walking with a man to execution, and he got leg irons, his hands are handcuffed, he's surrounded by guards, he's rendered defenseless, and he says to me, "Sister, please pray God holds up my legs." And I asked him, where is the dignity in this death? Can you help the Church solidify its opposition to the death penalty? And when the Pope came to St. Louis in 99, he was the first one to put the death penalty in with the other pro-life issues, and he said no to abortion, no to physician-assisted suicide, and no to the death penalty because it's cruel and unnecessary, and even those among us who have done a terrible crime have a dignity that must not be taken from them. He definitely paved the way, and he's quoted in this new statement in the Catechism that Pope Francis has just sent out.
I believe the change that John Paul II initiated in 95 and 97, in his mind, I think, was essentially saying that the death penalty was indefensible, because what he argued was that the only justification for its possible use would be the threat to society from a person who's capable of those kinds of acts. And then there was a small clause that said something to the effect of, given contemporary incarceration methods and systems, it's hard to imagine how that danger could be real. Do you think at the time he thought he was closing the door on the death penalty, and it still didn't happen?
Well, he was closing it a lot, but guess which line? District attorneys for the death penalty, governors for the death penalty. Guess the line they would quote was that the death penalty is rare, if not non-existent, but can be used in cases of absolute necessity.
Yeah.
So guess what happened? So here's a terrible murder, and so you have the DA saying, look at the terribleness of this murder. This is an absolute necessity. And those loopholes were just in there, see, because the church had part of its teaching, all the bishop's statements through the 70s, all through the 80s in the United States, always had a cardinal principle in it. The state has a right to take life. And so that was then that fundamental thing, that the state has the right to take life. Well, then you're going to give them the power then to decide in what cases they can take life. So what happened here was inadmissible in all circumstances, because no matter how grievous the crime, that person's inviolable dignity cannot be abused, and that's the difference. So now there are no exceptions, so that's big. It's a big change.
Yeah. Now, with the most of Western Europe, except for Belarus, I believe, well, they're outside of Western Europe, most advanced economies having already outlawed the death penalty. I believe only Japan and does South Korea maintain a death penalty? Is this revision directed right at the United States? I mean, I believe we're the only member of the Organization of Economic Development community that still practices the death penalty.
Yeah, well, and then say countries like Japan get their signals from the United States. They just executed 6 people who had poisoned people in the subway. So we are the only Western industrialized country in the world that still practices it. So yes, we need to get on board. And what's beautiful about this is, at last now we can stand with other countries in like Amnesty International, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, no exceptions, Article 3, every human being has a right to life without exception. And then now we can stand there with all of them. So there are 195 or so countries in the world, and far over half of them, maybe 60, 70% of them don't practice death penalty anymore. So
well,
we need to
the report
join.
I read this morning from Amnesty International said that of something like 88% of all the world's nations last year, there were no executions, 170 out of 193. Yeah. We were alone with like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, China, India. So it's not the best, in terms of jurisprudence, company. It's not the best company that we're in.
Right. But look, in our own country, though, we are reducing. The first signal you look to see when a country is abolishing the death penalty is what it does in practice. And now we see executions way down, the lowest that they have been, death penalties way down, the lowest they've been, and more we are recognizing a discriminatory pattern, that there's a very small percentage, 2% of counties are the one that seek the death penalty the most, and most of those are in the southern states that practice slavery. So we're beginning to see the shutting down of the death penalty. There's not much zeal anymore for practicing the death penalty, and that's a way we can see its abolition beginning to happen in our country.
That's right. In fact, Governor Cuomo today from New York, seizing this opportunity, said he's going to pursue the formal abolition of the death penalty in New York. It hasn't been practiced in years. Sister, I've got a question for you from Anthony from Facebook. And Anthony asks, Sister Helen, how do you respond to Catholics who claim that Pope Francis's actions today go against tradition? I believe there was quite a pushback, a lot of people arguing that the Pope can't change teaching. Of course, that's not how the Pope might see it. They use words like developing the tradition. Can you answer Anthony's questions? Is the Pope going against tradition?
Well, we can develop, like, for example, when we made statements as a church against slavery, would the claim be that we were going against tradition? Because you could look back and you could see that definitely there was a time when the church upheld slavery and quoted St. Paul's words, slaves obey your masters. And in the South, where I grew up in Louisiana, you could see the churches where the plantation owners would go to church and they would hear definitely that God supported slavery and they were okay morally as slave owners. And we changed that. So then do we say, oh, well, look, we changed the tradition? We grow as human beings, you know, and so there's always going to be development. For example, look at the development when St. Thomas Aquinas called, and said that it was okay to have the death penalty for violent people in society. They didn't have prisons. So the bent of the gospel is always going to be toward life. Now we have a way to keep society safe without imitating the violence and killing people. So is that going against tradition, or is that growing in the spirit of Jesus and his gospel?
Yeah, and I believe there's that one teaching document from way back. It said something about "Thou shalt not kill." That might be pertaining.
That one teaching document. You mean that Moses brought down from the top of the mountain?
Yeah, Moses, that guy.
Document? Yeah, that was chiseled in stone. I heard too.
Yeah, worth listening to when it's chiseled in stone. I've got another question from Twitter. Would Catholic officials in the United States who publicly proclaim the moral validity of the death penalty, are they likely to be reprimanded by church leaders now because of this shift in the catechism?
Yeah, well, it's not going to be so much bishops standing up and saying, hey, I'll believe in the death penalty. It's their non-action that we have to watch, because the Pope here is calling for, and the catechism is calling for, activism to abolish, to work for the abolition. And it's when hierarchy are silent. They'll be all over certain moral issues, but when the death penalty comes up and you have in the hearing in the legislatures, their non-appearance, their silence says everything. That's more what we have to look for, and to call our officials, our hierarchy, our leaders too. So primarily, it's got to be the people. It's got to be the people awakening to the gospel and acting, and hopefully bishops will come with us, clerics will come with us, and we do it together as a church.
Now abortion has been over the years one of those hot button problems for Catholic politicians, and they've taken sort of the position, some of them, especially in the Democratic Party, out of necessity, more or less, that they may be personally opposed to abortion, but they'll go along with the sort of the plurality of opinion in a free society on it. And that was sort of Tim Kaine's position when he did not commute a few death sentences in Virginia. Is this going to be the same kind of phenomenon, political phenomenon in the United States, do you think, where Catholic politicians will be asked to speak on this issue?
What do you mean Tim Kaine didn't commute sentences because of abortion? I don't get the connection in what you said there.
No, it wasn't. I believe he allowed a few executions to go through. Am I mixing him up with another Virginia politician? It's possible. I am another Catholic politician.
Okay. Well, here's the thing. When you say you're a pro-life person, mm-hmm. and you're for life, you're for all life, the seamless garment of life, right? And so when you can stand and be morally opposed to abortion, and that's where I am. I'm in the seamless garment. But to see the difference, and the thing to keep our eye on here at this point is what's changed in the catechism teaching now is, before it was always the inviolable dignity of innocent life. The catechism used that language. So of course the unborn, the dignity of the unborn. Of course the dignity of children who are vulnerable. But people generally drew a line and said, yeah, but when people do these terrible murders, they deserve the consequences of what they do, and they deserve the punishment. And now that's what's changed, that even those who do terrible crimes have an inviolable dignity. It's not just for innocent life. So our challenge as Catholics, when we say we're part of the seamless garment and believe in the dignity of all life, it means we believe that unborn children have a right to be born. Of course, we stand for the value of unborn babies, but we also stand for the value of people who have committed murder, but are more than that one act. We stand for it across the board, not just for innocent life, but also for guilty life.
Yeah, I think Sister just answered this next question from Jose on Facebook. Is there any crime horrific enough to justify the death penalty? What do you think, Sister Helen? I think you pretty much.
Yep. No, but that's a key question, see, because and that's where the change has been. Is there any crime? So then some people say, well, what about people that do terrorism? That needs to be reserved for the death penalty. Or people who go in and do mass killing them. That's reserved for the death penalty.
Yeah.
And this is saying, no, it's always inadmissible, because the essential act of rendering a person defenseless and killing them, and this comes out in what was said in the new teaching in the catechism, or the developed teaching, if I may say, is it's a voluntary, intentional act to kill someone who's been rendered defenseless. And the basis of the church's support for the death penalty has always been self-defense, like of society.
Yeah.
But when
in fact,
you have
John
a way
Paul had
to
already,
defend,
that was already addressed
Yep.
with John Paul when he said the only way it's acceptable is in defense of society from an individual, and it's simultaneously argued that's almost very hard to imagine in today's society.
well, he said that, but then he said, but in cases of absolute necessity, the death penalty could be used, and that was a loophole.
Yeah.
He pushed it. He opened the door really, really, really wide, but now it's been opened all the way, like no exceptions, inadmissible in every case. See, if you don't do that, then you have district attorneys who are going to invariably come up, or government officials, and saying there was a terrible terrorist attack that killed 50 people in our city, and so we're going for the death penalty. Or ISIS people. I mean, this just happened that Britain is going to not refuse to extradite two people that were involved in ISIS terrorist crimes. Before, they would never extradite them to the United States, but now they're willing to do it because of the mood that's in the air of using more violence to try to control things in society, keeping immigrants out of countries, and all of that is in the air these days. So this is a timely act for the church to come down in such a strong way for life and against the death penalty in all cases.
So Pope Francis is taking the opportunity today to clear the air a little bit on this particular church teaching. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sister Helen, and thank you,
Yes.
our audience at home. You can find our audience at home are watching Developing Story, let me reiterate. You can find continuing coverage of this and many other issues at our website, americamagazine.org. Once again, thank you so much, Sister Helen. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Bye-bye.